Hans went down into the storage room and hid among the food as the ship neared the port of Wesselton. He could hear the sound of the horns ringing out as he felt the ship slowly come to a stop. Directly above Hans was the upper deck, and the footsteps sounded like thunder through the floorboards as the Duke and his men boarded the ship to greet the queens of Arendelle. Hans could hardly hear what they were saying, but he could tell that the greetings seemed casual, and it was only a few minutes before he heard everyone above him walk off the ship. "I should give them another hour before going, then it's straight to the inn," Hans thought to himself as he slowly moved toward the door that would lead him out of the storage room. He sat with his back pressed up against the door and pulled out the book he had been reading, only this time he was unable to bring himself to open it. "I wonder what Lars would think of me now. Would he be proud that I'm doing things for me instead of my father for once? Or would he feel let down because I've still found myself in trouble?" he thought as he leaned his head back against the door. Hans spent the next hour deep in thought, but before long he realized he'd better get off the ship and find an inn before it got too late. He stood up from the floor and slowly opened the door as he listened closely. When Hans didn't hear any movement, he slowly began to make his way through the interior of the ship, and when he made it to the topside exit, he began to hold his breath. "This is it," Hans thought, hoping he'd waited long enough for the Duke to clear the port of his personal guard and anyone who might recognize him. As he slowly opened the door, Hans almost had a heart attack as one of the crewmen grabbed it from the other side and swung it open. "You don't have to worry. Nobody's looking for you out here," the scraggly bearded man said to Hans, as he laughed to himself after seeing the fear on the prince's face. Hans sighed in relief as he walked across the ship's deck and down onto the dock below. He kept his head on a swivel as he looked around for anyone who might pose a threat to his operation. Hans made his way into the dukedom of Wesselton as quickly as he could. He made sure to lift his hood before stepping into the actual streets of the city to conceal his appearance as best he could without drawing too much attention to himself. It was around midday by the time Hans came upon the city's marketplace in search of an inn to stay at. He was amazed at the number of people walking in the streets. "It wasn't like this the last time I was here," he thought as he made his way through the crowd. As Hans walked toward the center of the marketplace, he noticed a large fountain in the middle of an intersection. The very sight of it brought him back to a memory from his childhood. Hans could remember spending hours there with Lars as a child, the two of them just watching the water flow. He was so amazed by the inner working of that fountain, Hans thought before shaking his head. "Now's not the time to reminisce," he said to himself as he continued walking through the market, not realizing that while he was standing near the fountain, someone began watching him. He walked away from the fountain, and after making his way past a few of the smaller market stalls, he pulled someone aside and asked, "Excuse me, I'm looking for the Duke's palace. Can you point me there?" The person he had asked looked confused, but was quick to point Hans toward the palace. "Thank you," Hans said as he proceeded to walk in the opposite direction he was told to go. "The farther I am from the palace and the port, the farther I am from most of the guards," he thought as he made his way away from the palace. After a few minutes of walking, Hans saw a sign that read, "The Cobblestone Inn." Despite the warm, welcoming name, the building itself looked like it was deteriorating. "Well, this looks homely," Hans thought to himself, which made him chuckle as he walked up to the door. "It's as good a place as any, I suppose," he thought before entering the Cobblestone Inn. As soon as he stepped through the door, Hans was greeted by the innkeeper, a short, elderly blonde woman named Agatha.
"Hello, young man. What can we do for you?"
Yes," Hans said as he cleared his throat. "I'm looking for a room if you have one, but I don't have much coin, so I'll take the cheapest one that you have if that's okay, ma'am."
"Of course, dear,"
the woman said as she moved around from behind the counter.
"All of our rooms are the same price, but I'll be happy to work with you. It's the slow season after all."
The woman's smile melted right through Hans, who hadn't felt that almost motherly warmth since he was a baby. "Thank you very much, ma'am," Hans said as he pulled a small pouch of coins from his belt that Elsa had given him to cover room and board. "Now, I don't know how long I'll be needing a room, but this is all I have. I hope that's all right." The woman continued to smile as she took the bag of coins from Hans.
"Oh, child, it's more than enough. You look like you could use some kindness."
Hans couldn't help but smile as he accepted the key to his room from the elderly woman. "Thank you," he said as he turned to walk toward his room. But before stepping away from the desk, he asked the woman one last question. "Do you know where I might find a good tavern nearby?"
Of course, child, but don't go losing yourself so much that you can't find your way home,"
replied the innkeeper. Hans couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. If only she knew, he thought as he made his way into the room he had just rented. As the day turned into night, Hans left the cobblestone inn and began heading toward the tavern the innkeeper had told him about. Unbeknownst to him was that he wasn't alone. Following at a distance, someone seemed to be tracking the young prince wherever he went in Wesselton. Hans was unaware that he was being followed and continued toward the tavern. Once he found it, he headed inside and slowly began walking around the room, feeling out each conversation he was overhearing. How am I possibly going to get one of these guys to start talking about some random ship captain? Hans thought as he tried mingling with some of the other people in the tavern. Starting a conversation with people he didn't know was tough at first, but eventually Hans overheard a single sentence that gave him the perfect opportunity to chime in.
"Oh, buzz off! The Duke of Wesselton's a buffoon and you all know it,"
yelled out a drunkard who seemed to be having an intense conversation with a group of men in the corner of the tavern. Hans didn't waste any time as he ventured over to the group.
"You know, I always say the little man seems like a weasel to me."
He burst out laughing, expecting to be joined by the other man who he had overheard bad-mouthing the Duke a moment ago. But when no one laughed with him, Hans' chuckle slowly trailed off into awkward yammering.
Little weasel?"
He explained hesitantly, but he was met with silence. Another awkward second passed before everyone around him burst into laughter.
"A weasel?"
one of them yelled through his laughter.
"Oh, that's a good one."
Hans laughed nervously as he began to grow comfortable around the group he had finally started a conversation with, though he didn't think that he should bring up the ship captain right away. As Hans worked his way around the dukedom of Wesselton, Queens Elsa and Anna, as well as Kristoff and the royal guards, were escorted into the Duke's palace where he offered them a large meal. The group sat down to eat in the large stone dining hall lined with banners carrying the crest of Wesselton. Kristoff began filling up his plate with large portions of food without hesitating, but he was quickly interrupted as the Duke couldn't hold back his questions any longer.
"May I ask you something, Queen Elsa?"
The Duke turned to face the Queen. Elsa quickly responded as she joined Kristoff in enjoying the meal. "Of course, anything you like. I'd hate for you to think that I was hiding something." She made sure to look over to the Duke to see if that got a reaction out of him. The Duke straightened up in his seat.
"I'm curious to know why you are really here."
Elsa looked confused. "I'm not sure what you mean. I told you that I was to be making my rounds in the neighboring kingdoms and dukedoms to pay my respects and officially introduce myself to the people in charge of these wondrous lands." Elsa smiled at the Duke as she tried to sell her lie.
"But Queen Elsa,"
the Duke said as he slowly leaned forward in his seat,
"if your plan is to visit all the lands that you neighbor, surely you will need more than just one small ship."
Elsa's eyes widened and Kristoff began to chew slower as he grew more concerned with the Duke's questioning. The Duke continued talking.
"I mean, to get to some of the villages in the mountains, you would need at least a few sleds and animals to pull them, but you don't seem to have any of that."
Silence overcame the room as Elsa struggled to find an answer.
"So, I'll ask you one more time, and before I do, I'll remind you that you are in my home,"
the Duke said assertively before asking again very slowly.
"What are you really doing here?"
As the night dragged on, Hans realized that he had gotten all of the talking that he could get out of the fellows from the tavern, most of whom could hardly speak in complete sentences by that point. So he decided to head back to the inn and get some sleep before trying again in the morning. Hans headed out into the streets of Wesselton and began walking back toward the inn where he was staying when out of nowhere he felt somebody grab him from behind. Even though he hadn't had anything to drink in the tavern, Hans was so tired from staying up all night on the ship that he could hardly fight back. He was quickly dragged into the dark alley beside the tavern. Hans cried out for help as he was pulled into the darkness.